This event is jointly organized by ISAS and the Sri Lanka High Commission of Singapore. I would like to first invite Associate Professor Dr. Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director, ISAS, to deliver the welcome remarks. Dr. Sevia, please.
Your Excellency, Sashikala Premawardana, High Commissioner of Sri Lanka to Singapore, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and speakers. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and the High Commission of Sri Lanka in Singapore, I welcome you to this joint book launch and panel discussion on Singapore-Sri Lanka relations, perspectives from Sri Lanka. Singapore and Sri Lanka are both historically connected small states. They have a shared past. They also have confronted similar challenges and charted somewhat of similar trajectories of development as well. They are both plural and heterogeneous societies, and even at a geopolitical level, they are similarly constrained. Both are surrounded by bigger states and have to negotiate their positions vis-a-vis broader geopolitical tensions and competition. As many of us know, Sri Lanka was considered an inspiration for Singapore's founding father, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. On its part, as Sri Lanka negotiates its own path out of its economic crisis, Singapore may actually provide Colombo some important lessons in how Singapore has negotiated its own rise as a global hub. Importantly, while both Sri Lanka and Singapore have negotiated challenges and explored opportunities in their own unique ways, they enjoy strong bilateral relations underpinned by long-standing economic and people-to-people ties. The year 2020 marked the 50th anniversary of formal diplomatic relations between Singapore and Sri Lanka. Given this, the Sri Lankan High Commission in Singapore and the Institute of South Asian Studies began a joint effort on a collection of essays to explore the various facets of the bilateral ties. Entitled Singapore and Sri Lanka at 50, Perspectives from Sri Lanka, the book contains papers by scholars from Sri Lanka and Singapore. They examine the historical and contemporary aspects of the relations and discuss comprehensive areas of economic, security, and diplomatic relations. They also outline common challenges and areas of cooperation between the two sides. As many of you may know, the Institute of South Asian Studies is an autonomous research institute based in the National University of Singapore. In addition to the socio-economic and political developments in South Asian countries, we're committed to studying contemporary South Asia broadly. And this includes the foreign relations of individual South Asian states, but also their relationships with states beyond South Asia and regions beyond South Asia as well. Within this context, Sri Lanka is an important part of our study and analysis as well. And this book that we are launching today is a manifestation of our interest in continued work on Sri Lanka. I am pleased that we will be launching the publication this afternoon. I would like to congratulate the editors of the volume, Dr. George Cook, Dr. Chulani Atanayake, and Ms. Ramita Iyer. And the chapter, I would also like to thank the chapter contributors for putting the book together. I'm certain that this publication will be a valuable resource in addition to the body of work on Singapore and Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka relations as well. I look forward to the launch of the book and the discussion thereafter. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Sevia. I would like to now invite Her Excellency Sashika Premawardana, High Commissioner of Sri Lanka to Singapore, to deliver her address. Your Excellency, please.
Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Excellencies, representatives of diplomatic missions in Singapore, distinguished academics, guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's with great pleasure and a deep sense of honor that I stand before you today to introduce this remarkable edited volume titled Singapore and Sri Lanka at 50, Perspectives from Sri Lanka. This edited volume represents a culmination of years of dedicated research, collaboration, and scholarly endeavor. It is a comprehensive exploration of the diplomatic relations between our two countries, And it delves into a multitude of dimensions, including historical, social, economic, security, diplomatic, and environmental aspects, and also the potential that lies ahead in our bilateral relations. On behalf of the High Commission of Sri Lanka in Singapore, I wish to extend a warm welcome to all friends of Sri Lanka present here today. My sincere appreciation goes to the Institute of South Asian Studies of the National University of Singapore for their efforts and contribution to publish this book. Let me also acknowledge and express gratitude to the representatives of the Government of Singapore, High Commissioners and Ambassadors, and representatives of the Diplomatic Corps for being with us today. Your presence is a testament to the importance of fostering goodwill, understanding, and harmony between our two nations and the global community. Ladies and gentlemen, this volume commemorates the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Sri Lanka and Singapore, and provides an opportunity to examine the multifaceted nature of the engagement. This significant milestone is also an apt time for reflection on the journey, achievements, and the future prospects of this enduring partnership. The timing is made even more special as this launch is being held in the year that we commemorate the 75th anniversary of Sri Lanka's independence. Despite geographical distance that separates our nations, the bond we share is rooted in a warm and abiding friendship that has stood the test of time. Although formal diplomatic relations between the two countries were established in July 1970, our relationship is built on a strong cultural and historical foundation dating back to a time when both Sri Lanka and Singapore were pivotal points along the ancient maritime trade routes. Both countries share long-standing friendly ties, nurtured by deep-rooted linkages at community and societal levels. The relationship has evolved, encompassing a wide range of pillars of cooperation and is underpinned by mutual respect, trust, and understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, it is said that Sri Lanka, the pearl of the Indian Ocean, was responsible for inspiring much of Singapore's progress in its formative years. Sri Lankans have been coming to Singapore since the early 1900s and have been instrumental in helping Singapore on its way to becoming the vibrant nation it is today. Their contributions in the areas of civil service, education, engineering, law, medicine, and sport are well recorded and acknowledged. According to official records, the first batch of Ceylonese, mainly Jaffna Tamils, in the Strait Settlement Civil Services arrived here in 1867, and the community has since then grown manifold. Today, the evidence of their contribution is visible in various landmarks around the island nation, including the famous Ceylon Road and the Ceylon Sports Club. A lesser known fact is the Ceylonese Christian clergy played a founding role establishing Methodist churches and mission schools in Singapore, like the Methodist Girls' School. One of the most prominent Sri Lankan Buddhist temples of the Theravada tradition, the Sri Lanka Ramaya Temple, which is operated by the Singapore Sinhala Buddhist Association, was established in 1920. And with the arrival of the members of the Ceylon Pioneer Corps to Singapore from Sri Lanka with Lord Mountbatten's British forces at the end of World War II, in 1945, the temple was relocated to St. Michael's Road, where it is currently located on some 2 acres of land. These linkages demonstrate the close societal and community linkages that exist between our two countries. There have been many eminent Sri Lankans who have contributed significantly to Singapore's nation-building process and remarkable journey to becoming a global hub for trade, manufacturing, and finance. Today, the thriving Sri Lankan community in Singapore stands as a living testament to this legacy. The 13,000 strong Sri Lankan community currently in Singapore continues to build on this legacy. While our paths have diverged in certain aspects, both our countries have shared common challenges and aspirations. Sri Lanka's openness to international trade and investment, coupled with its social welfare system, set the stage for a literate society and advanced healthcare. However, decades of conflict and the scourge of terrorism pose significant challenges to our progress. Today, as we look ahead, we find inspiration in Singapore's development model and its ability to transform itself into a global hub. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to inform that we are seeing steady progress on economic recovery in Sri Lanka following the unprecedented socio-economic crisis experienced in 2022. The IMF Extended Fund Facility has been secured and the first tranche has been released. Inflation has gone down from 70% to 6% by last month. Interest rates have also declined from 30% to about 12%. Growth rate contraction is expected to lessen to about 2 to 3% from about 7 to 8%. The government of Sri Lanka is looking at a 25-year reformist program focused on building an export-oriented competitive economy, an environmentally friendly green and blue economy, and a digital economy. The bilateral relationship has strengthened with frequent high-level political interactions taking place throughout the year 2022 and 2023, including the recently concluded successful working visit of His Excellency Ranil Wickremesinghe, President of Sri Lanka, to Singapore. During the visit, President Wickremesinghe held wide-ranging bilateral discussions with Singapore's President, Madam Halima Yaacob, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, and senior ministers of the government of Singapore, aimed at augmenting bilateral relations, prioritizing economic, defense, and environmental cooperation between the two countries. Highlighting the importance placed by both countries on the need to enhance cooperation to meet the challenges posed by climate change, a memorandum of understanding for collaboration on carbon credits under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement was inked. During the visit, Minister for Defense of Singapore called on President Wickremesinghe and exchanged views on enhancing closer security and defense cooperation between Sri Lanka and Singapore. Minister of Sustainability and the Environment of Singapore, Grace Fu, also called on President Wickremesinghe during the visit. The engagements and meetings that have taken place during the other official visits, which were undertaken by the Foreign Minister, State Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministers of Justice and Public Security, have laid the foundation for the future of our work as friends and partners. While we celebrate this anniversary and our shared history, we look towards deepening cooperation with Singapore, drawing strength from our historical underpinnings and chart our course for a new era of collaboration. As island nations, Singapore and Sri Lanka are located in unique positions that strengthen connectivity and affinity. Given its strategic location close to the enormous market of South Asia, with a rich base of human capital, Sri Lanka could continue to enjoy sustainable benefits to foster its economic development and to place the country on an augmented trajectory of growth, offering opportunities for Singapore to increase its footprint in South Asia. Therefore, it is imperative that clear strategizing, comprehensive policies, and realistic plans of activities are entrenched into the bilateral engagement in all sectors, enabling the two nations to continue to engage both bilaterally and multilaterally. It is our hope that these relations will continue to grow and expand into new and innovative areas of cooperation in the coming years. It is my fervent wish that our two great countries would continue to work together on vital issues for the mutual benefit and well-being of our two peoples in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the edited volume, which we launched today, is more than a collection of academic essays. It is a testament to the depth and complexity of our bilateral relations. This book traverses a wide spectrum of themes, offering a predominantly Sri Lankan perspective, presenting both successes and challenges encountered along the way. It's divided into 5 sections. It spans a range of topics covering historical and social perspectives, economic relations, security cooperation, diplomatic relations, and multilateral cooperation, and environmental and climate change issues. I consider this book a fitting tribute to the depth and breadth of connections between Sri Lanka and Singapore. The world we inhabit today is rife with challenges that transcend national borders. From climate change to terrorism, from economic uncertainty to global health crises, the interconnectedness of our world necessitates collaboration and shared solutions. In this context, the concluding chapters of this volume assume a critical role. We are invited to contemplate the future trajectory of our diplomatic relationship, offering insightful perspectives on potential avenues for further collaboration. They also encourage us to confront emerging global challenges head-on and devise strategies to overcome shared obstacles. I take this opportunity to commend the work of the editors of this book, Dr. Cholani Attanayake, Dr. George Cook, and Ms. Ramita Iyer. Their commitment to producing a comprehensive collection of chapters that has resulted in a rich repository of knowledge that will undoubtedly enrich the discourse surrounding international diplomacy. I extend my deepest appreciation to them for their tireless efforts. Equally deserving of our gratitude are the contributors to this edited volume. These scholars from both Sri Lanka and Singapore have invested their time, expertise, and passion, producing insightful chapters that provide fresh perspectives on our relationship. Their collective contribution will undoubtedly serve as a catalyst for further research, dialogue, and exploration. As we immerse ourselves in the pages of this book, we are reminded of the transformative power of diplomacy. Diplomacy, after all, is not merely the business of governments. It is the art of building bridges between cultures, fostering understanding, and nurturing lasting friendships. I encourage all readers to delve into the intricacies of the relationship between Sri Lanka and Singapore, to explore the nuanced dynamics that have shaped our journey, and to envision the boundless possibilities that lie ahead. Thank you also to the panelists, Dr. Rajni Gamage, postdoctoral fellow, ISAS, Ms. Nithya Subramaniam, reputed journalist, Mr. Senura Abewadana, head of public policy at Meta, for being here today and agreeing to share insights on the Singapore-Sri Lanka relationship. Udan, thank you very much also for coming in on the last moment and agreeing to chair the panel. I look forward to hearing their perspectives. In conclusion, I would like once again to express my profound gratitude to the director and academic staff and the management of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore for your support and cooperation for this joint effort to publish the edited volume, and specially sponsoring and arranging this ceremony at the NUSS Guild House. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you for your presence here today. Your participation is a reflection of the significance we attach to the relationship between our two nations. It is your support and engagement that will propel our bilateral ties into the future, ensuring that the flame of collaboration and friendship burns bright for generations to come. By recommending this book, we look forward to further promoting mutual study, mutual understanding, and joint development between our two countries, bringing more benefit to the peoples of our two countries. Here's to the next 50 years of our work together, focused on people, development, and partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We will now proceed with the launch of the book. I'd also like to invite the panelists to join us on stage for a group photo. Thank you. Now we will proceed with the panel discussion. I'd like to invite on stage the following distinguished speakers: Dr. Rajni Gamage, Postdoctoral Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore; Ms. Nithya Subramanian, journalist; Ms. Senura Abewardana, Head of Public Policy, Central Asia, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. And finally, the book discussion will be moderated by Dr. Udan Fernando, Consultant, Association for Asian Studies, USA, and Head, Colombo Charter, Asian Civil Society Research Network, University of Melbourne. And I now hand over the session to Dr. Fernando.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event. And I would straight away get on with the job that I'm entrusted to. But let me first thank ISS for inviting me. It was short notice, but an event like this is always a challenge and also pleasure, and also an opportunity for me to learn a lot from the rest of the panelists and also the participants. So I was very pleased to accept this rather short notice to moderate this panel. So what I would do is to kind of build on what the director of ISS and also the High Commissioner has already established. They both gave a very good historical and also contextual background of the publication and the kind of the themes around that. And what I would try to do is to invite my panelists who are from very different backgrounds, professional and otherwise, and training, to share their views on the theme of 50 years of relations between Sri Lanka and Singapore. But before that, let me make a very short remark about the 50 years of history between the two countries. Regionally, of course, in a broader Asian sense, both Sri Lanka and Singapore belong to one kind of, regional entity. But if you go on the sub-regional level, the two countries are very different. But despite those differences, it's interesting how both countries have developed very close relationships with each other over time. And 50 years is a long period of time. And the most interesting thing for us to note is that over this time, the two countries have drawn inspiration from each other. And there is a kind of an evolution of inspiration and evolution of role models. And it's very much a kind of a cliche or a kind of, hacked statement, especially, excuse me, among the older people in Sri Lanka, referring to what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has remarked about Sri Lanka as a role model that Singapore should follow. And this is also written in his memoirs I have read. And there is a reference to his father's connection with Sri Lankan business and so on and so forth. So initially, Singapore saw Sri Lanka as a role model, a place, a country, a model that should, be looked as a source of inspiration as they were building the country in Singapore. But over time, Singapore was quick and efficient to accelerate its journey. And by the late 70s, Sri Lanka started looking at Singapore. And since this has been my observation, since the late 70s, Singapore has always been the role model for Sri Lanka. From time to time, Sri Lanka, when, even with the change of governments, they always refer to a particular country or two to follow. And in the early 70s, we had a huge influence of the socialist countries, and we were part of the non-aligned movement and so forth. But after that, Singapore always became the wannabe kind of factor for Sri Lanka. And this is at a policy level as well as at the popular level. So Singaporean going to Singapore, Singapore-like has always been a kind of a popular sentiment in addition to economic policy level kind of a consideration. So it's interesting how each country has inspired each other and how their respective trajectories have evolved. And listening to what the High Commissioner shared with us about the recent visit of the President, the gamut of work he had done while he was here for a very short period of time, it's unbelievable, the kind of, the wide scope of work that he had tried to kind of, to cover. And that's, I believe, with the support and the understanding and cooperation of its counterpart, which is Singapore. So we see a kind of a new phase of relationship being kind of cemented or kind of renewed at this stage. And as the High Commissioner remarked, we fervently hope that this would kind of be a turning point in the relationship between the two countries. So that's with that preface, I would like to ask my panel. Their bios are given in the in this your program flyer. So I'm not going to read their full kind of professional and educational information in the interest of time. But the three panelists, Nitya is basically professionally a journalist, so it's easy for me to introduce her. And then to my right, Rajni is a social scientist, and Senura, who is in the extreme right, is a difficult professional category to describe in a word or two. He's trained as a lawyer, but he's in the area of ICT, social media. And so therefore, I would ask the three panelists to take a minute or two to kind of tell us from which angle, professional or academic or otherwise, that they would like to discuss our topic this afternoon. That would also give us a flavor of where they come from, their kind of, tools of analysis and so on. So let me start with Senura. What's the lens, that you're trying to look at the 50 years of relations?
Thank you for the kind introduction, Udan, and that's a really good way to open, I think. And having, been born and brought up in Sri Lanka, like if I may take a bit of time to set out the timeline, born in 82, right? And for the next 30 years, we saw conflict, right? And it is in that context when I had the opportunity to travel and explore, and where I came across to Singapore in about, I think 1995, when I was about 13 years old for the first time. And since then, in every family circle, or as we grew up in school, university, then in professional life, like you said, everyone looked to this lighthouse called Singapore. And it's something that we always, like as kids growing up, desire to be part of that experience of having a great life, frankly. And when I got the opportunity to go through this book, I reflected when you reflect about what is contained in, and there's a lot of information in this book. And what I found was the missed opportunities, right, as a country, where Sri Lanka has missed certain opportunities. But at the same time, there has been a cross-pollination. Some things have been done right, where Sri Lankan citizens have, like me and all of us here, have had access to great education, decent healthcare in this process. So how I reflect upon it's a lot of mixed feelings, but at the same time, when you look forward, especially in the digital space, there are certain things that we have gotten right, and possibly Singapore has influenced that thinking, and that's how I went through, and these are my initial thoughts about how I read through that book.
Great. So ladies and gentlemen, Senura is going to kind of focus more on the opportunities that had been there and how they were missed or kind of, exploited. That's great. It's more kind of contemporary, and maybe you take a couple of decades or so, backwards. Right? Yeah, good. Raj, what's your lens or kind of analytical framework this afternoon to unpack the topic?
Thank you, Dan. So I'm a political scientist by training, so that would be primarily the kind of angle of analysis that I will use to approach these issues. Specifically, I'll be looking at some of the, just to kind of contextualize, I'm interested in studying politics of inequality, elite politics, political parties and ideology and such. So I thought that I would bring these perspectives to kind of look at what domestic factors would bear most significantly on the current and the future of Sri Lanka's foreign policy, and that includes bilateral relations with Singapore.
So I'm going to compare the two countries?
No, I'll be almost exclusively focusing on the current domestic political moment in Sri Lanka.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. Last but not least, Nitya, what's going to be your kind of, angle?
As Udan mentioned, I'm a journalist by training, and I moved to Singapore as an expat in 2006, and that was when my curiosity about South Asian diaspora peaked, and that was when I also came in contact with people from all three countries, or all four countries of the subcontinent. So what I've done in my paper, my essay basically looks at the historical contributions made by Sri Lankans, the pioneers to Singapore. And it is not just an academic work. I use some of my journalistic training to meet people and talk to them. And that's when I think a lot of first-person account in it has brought some color and flavor to my essay. So my conversation would be based on that. Thank you.
Excellent. I think that's also a good way to start things, and for your information, Nitya is also a contributor to this volume. So she had also contributed a chapter, so we can also hear what she had, I think your presentation would give us information, flavor of what you have written in the chapter as well. So let's start with kind of a historical, the early stages of, the relationship between the two countries. So over to you. So I'll give you 8 minutes. Thank you. Yeah, if you like, yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for coming in today, this afternoon, and especially thanks to the Institute of South Asian Studies and the Sri Lankan High Commission for organizing this launch and also giving me an opportunity to speak. So as I just mentioned, my paper focuses on the people-to-people relations between the two nations and the contributions of the diaspora, primarily during the colonial and post-colonial era. But of course, the connections are far older. Long before the advent of the colonial rule, Buddhist monks and nuns who crossed the Bay of Bengal influenced religious developments in Southeast Asia. This movement was further facilitated by advances in navigation technology that witnessed a quantum leap in the 4th and 5th centuries. Sri Lanka's influence in the Southeast Asian culture goes back to the 8th century when Anuradhapura-style statues were discovered in different parts of this region. Around the 11th century, Sinhalese form of Buddhism was accepted in Myanmar, parts of North Thailand, Cambodia, southern Vietnam, Laos, and southwestern region of China around the Yunnan province. They adopted the Sinhala Vamsa or order and not only impacted religion and philosophy, but also art, architecture, and literature. It was much later that convicts from Ceylon under the Dutch and British administrations were the first immigrants to this region. They were offered release in return for emigration. The modern day linkages between Sri Lanka and Singapore, as the High Commissioner rightly said, can be traced to the early 1800s when the latter was part of the Malayan Peninsula under the British. It was in the 19th and 20th centuries that large numbers of educated Sri Lankan personnel were procured to develop the frontiers of the British Empire. Then a substantial number of immigrants were from the Jaffna Peninsula due to the fact that by the late 19th century, the region had a large cohort of English speakers. Many of the pioneers from Jaffna and other parts of Ceylon arrived here on the invitation of the British administrators who hired them for their language skill and good work ethics. Meanwhile, there were other Sinhalese who were privately employed in the jewelry trade as craftsmen and salesmen. In my paper, I had the opportunity of speaking to two such senior citizens who talked about their journey to Singapore and how they came in here to work in the jewelry business. Even during that time, the exquisite gems from Ceylon and the impeccable craftsmanship made them extremely popular amongst the locals who endorsed the fact that the best jewelry was made by Orang Ceylon, which in Malay means people from Ceylon. Soon after, these traders and jewelers settled in the port cities of Singapore, Malacca, and Penang, known as the Straits Settlements. The early migrants in the 19th century were mainly bachelors who lived together as a community. However, with the transfer of the Straits Settlements from British India to the Crown in 1867 and the signing of the Pangkor Treaty in 1874, the British involvement in the Malay states was enhanced. The establishment of the Malayan railways in the 1880s brought scores of Sinhalese and Jaffna Tamils to this part with the hope that they would lead better lives. The British occupation of Ceylon and Malaya Singapore also offered a source of confidence and stability to the immigrants. They were lured to the region by endless stories of opportunities for business and better salaries and employment. Interestingly, in the railways, the Jaffna Tamils were hired for better paying jobs on the clerical and administrative side, while the Sinhalese worked as laborers involved in laying tracks or other such activities. In fact, I was told by the two gentlemen whom I interviewed that there were only two Sinhalese men who were employed as engine drivers, which was supposed to be a coveted job at that point of time. The Ceylonese also had a head start in the rubber plantation and tin mining business. While many who worked in the rubber estates did not have prior experience, they were drawn to these due to better pay than the railways, as it offered free water, food, and lighting. Now, after the Ceylonese brought in bread and jewelry, it is also said that they have brought in crows here to control beetle pest in coconut plantations. The community, of course, also played an important part during World War II, when the Japanese occupied Singapore and Malaya in 1942, along with a large number of Indians. 25 Ceylonese under the leadership of Gladwin Kotawala joined the Indian Independence League and the Indian National Army headed by Subhash Chandra Bose. Consequently, a Ceylon department or Lanka unit was established. Among the many reasons for them to join the INA, including protecting themselves from the brutal Japanese warlords, was also the hope that along with India's independence, Sri Lanka too would be freed from British rule. They were also captured by the charisma of Subhash Chandra Bose, who believed the ties between India and Ceylon were strong and described the island as a pendant in the Indian necklace and therefore inseparable. This, of course, there were some skeptics, and many belonging to the middle and upper classes remained loyal with the British administration, which eventually won the war. There was another wave of migration from Sri Lanka at the end of World War II and the surrender of the Japanese in 1945, known as the Ceylon Pioneer Corps. Under the stewardship of Lord Mountbatten, they were tasked with assisting in rebuilding of the region. During the various waves of migration, settlers from Sri Lanka brought with them their religious, social, and cultural beliefs. Many of the organizations formed by them, as well as individuals, have shaped Singapore significantly. Over the decades, several Ceylonese pioneers have been involved in politics, civil service, medicine, education, and the arts. Even Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew's family, had a personal connection with this community, as his father, Lee Chin Koon, worked at BP De Silva's shop, a leading Sri Lankan jeweler at High Street, after he retired from Shell & Co. Former Prime Minister Lee once said, in terms of numbers, the Ceylonese are amongst the smallest of various communities. Yet in terms of achievements and contributions to the growth and development of modern Singapore and Malaysia, they have done more than warranted by their numbers. Today, this is visible in various landmarks across the island, including the famous Ceylon Road and Ceylon Sports Club, to name a few. The diaspora has played a crucial part in developing education and religious studies in Singapore. As Ma'am High Commissioner just mentioned, the Christian clergy set up the Methodist churches and mission schools, which are now known as Methodist Girls and Anglo-Chinese Schools for Boys, both institutions which are pillars of modern Singapore. Similarly, they also were responsible for promoting studies of Buddhism in the region. My essay also touches upon the outstanding contributions made by individuals who belong to Sri Lanka. These include presidential aspirant Tharman Shanmugaratnam, former Deputy Prime Minister S. Rajaratnam in politics, Dr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam's father, Kanagaratnam Shanmugaratnam, who's known as the father of pathology in Singapore, and Dr. Shan Ratnam, who specialized in human reproduction research. I also had a chance to speak with the people who are running Apsara Arts, which was founded by Neela Satyalingam, a leading art school in Singapore, and also had the opportunity previously to meet Dr. R. Thaivendran, who contributed to education. Even in modern times, people-to-people movement continues to exist between the two countries. While the fourth wave arrived during the Civil War in the 1980s, recently there has been an inflow of professionals in knowledge and technology-intensive occupations like cybersecurity, pharmaceuticals, research, and development. However, among the local Singaporean Ceylonese population, there have been some concerns about the lack of a unique identity, as they're often categorized under the broad umbrella of Indians. The prestige associated with being Ceylonese has sometimes led to tensions with the Indian diaspora. Prior to independence, the Sri Lankan community, especially the Tamils, enjoyed an elite status. So there are many now who prefer to identify themselves as Tamil to mitigate the India-Sri Lanka dichotomy. Nevertheless, in conclusion, it would not be wrong to say that the Sri Lankan diaspora continues to play a major role in this city-state. Compared to others, the size of the diaspora may not be very large, but it has certainly exerted tremendous influence to the growth and prosperity of Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitya. Thank you also for keeping to time. And Nitya's covered a lot, in the last 8 or 10 minutes, ranging from the historical patterns of migration, which is a very, very interesting kind of, dimension for us to dig deeper into this topic as a good starter. And you kind of identified different patterns, different periods of migration, and how the different vocations, different industries, trade have been represented by those who have migrated from Sri Lanka to Malaya and then to Singapore at a later stage. And also certain kind of, professional groups of late. And then finally, you kind of brought your analysis to contemporary times, problematizing certain, aspects like identity and so on, because these are certain kind of, challenges that Sri Lanka itself is struggling with. So let's go into detail, perhaps in the Q&A. So thank you very much for bringing this comprehensive account of the historical aspect of the relationship. So let me ask Senura to submit his ideas on the opportunities and challenges, how they were exploited, how they have been kind of missed, if that's the case, by Singapore. And maybe you could also make a kind of a slight kind of reference to Sri Lanka in terms of a comparative manner. Thank you.
Thanks, Sudan. And I got a chance to read through this book over the weekend. And as I reflected, I recall the Buddhist story about the two parrots who were born to the same nest, was caught up in a storm, and they were separated. One fell into a monastery, and the other ended up in a less desirable village, if I may say. And when it came to the parrot that was in the monastery, who had picked up the more desirable habits, and when it came to the parrot in the less desirable village, had picked up the less desirable habits. And when you when I was looking at this, and I was thinking about the counter narrative to this, would it be, and I was thinking through as to how the parrot that fell into the less desirable village, if he had made the right choices, it would have made a significant difference to his life. And we know making the right choices can lead to making a massive difference to one's life and destiny. And so this is exactly what Singapore excelled at. The choices it made and the difference it has made to the country and its people. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of being here, and thank you very much for that invitation. My appreciation goes out to the contributors and the editors of this book. And it's also an opportunity to congratulate Madam High Commissioner for her service here and for successfully completing her tenure. And we wish her well for her journey onwards. There is a saying that it's not the destination, but the journey that counts. Most of our Lankan leaders look towards Singapore as the lighthouse for anything and everything. The same way, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew also looked towards Sri Lanka as the model then, or rather Colombo as the model then. And if I may look at the three main choices that made Singapore the lighthouse. One, without political stability, sustainable development cannot be achieved. Economic prosperity is built on bridges that create access. And lastly, acceleration and growth is built on accountability. Stability for me is synonymous with Singapore, and at the heart of that stability is its language policy. Building nations is an extremely hard job, and the trade-offs have to be managed in this process. If you look to Singapore, Singapore opted for 4 official languages, 1 national language, and English as the working language, bringing parity amongst its communities. Though Sri Lanka has made significant progress and strides in its language policy, consistent implementation of the policy is to be desired, leading to old wounds not completely being healed. Singapore has mastered the art of access and creating that access for themselves. Access to the labor mobility, capital inflows, technology, and even prosperity. Singapore has done so much to build trusted bridges with her neighbors through consistent implementation of its economic policy, which is outward looking. And this, in my opinion, suits the smaller nations. Sri Lanka has been lowering its walls over the decades, but the government engaging in business, nationalization, appropriation of industry through the appropriation of underutilized and underperforming assets law, which was there until 2016, highlights the inconsistent approach adopted to build a more sustainable relationship, which would have been beneficial for Sri Lanka. This aspect has effectively gone into by Dr. Vignaraja, Dr. Kumaraswamy, and even Anushka Vijayasinghe in their contributions to this book. And lastly, I would like to talk about Singapore's political will and desire to contain corruption, crime, and the absolute consistency within which they have enforced their law. And this is across the board. And this has been built through the systems it has established. If you look at Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, Singapore ranks 5th, which as one of the cleanest places. Whereas Sri Lanka, if you look at it today, is at 101. There's a long road ahead to us to get for Sri Lanka to get their things right. The opportunity. Sri Lanka does not have to look too far away for a tried and tested model, which has worked and which has been successful. But in the digital sphere, Sri Lanka has delivered a very good, robust data protection bill. It has proposed a cybersecurity bill, which has been in the works since 2018, and now it is up for public consultation. This approach and the new approach with respect to the digital sphere must be appreciated. Sri Lanka has turned a corner here, thanks to the leadership of the likes of Mr. Jayantha Fernando of the ICTA, who took a progressive approach and moved away from a closed door policy making to open, consultative, and with an approach to build those bridges connecting industry, stakeholders, civil society, etc. Tangible results in this field can be achieved if Sri Lanka is able to take a lead from what Singapore has done with respect to their data protection, cybersecurity, and the whole internet governance approach. And implementation of these laws are critical to ensure full realization of the benefits of these policies. In 2023, Sri Lanka and Singapore found their roles reversed since the 1950s. Sri Lanka now looks to Singapore as the model. Though fate has interchanged the two countries, what matters now is the choices that we make. Stability, access, and accountability can be the three pillars on which Sri Lanka's future trajectory can be built. Thank you.
Thank you, Senura. I think it was, the certain kind of categories, the analytical categories that you have used are really interesting for us to shed light on our, subject this afternoon, particularly in the canvas of opportunities and challenges. You found the choices, the clarity with which we make the choices, and then the will that we have to implement. It's not making the choices, but also the will and commitment to, to implement. And you found stability, access, accountability as important building blocks of that model of success, if I may use that term. So it's interesting for us to kind of, to understand. We are yet to read the details of the book, the chapters, but this would also give us a kind of a flavor of certain, chapters that you have referred to. And so thank you very much for this inspiring, insights from you. And now I would ask Rajni to present her ideas, and Rajni's focus is going to be more kind of contemporary politics. And so we'll hear more of the Sri Lankan context and the challenges ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Udan. Good evening, Your Excellency Sashikala Premadana, High Commissioner of Sri Lanka to Singapore, distinguished guests and members of the audience. So it's a privilege for me to speak here today at the soft launch of this book. And I would like to congratulate the editors as well as the contributors for reflecting on bilateral relations, but in doing so, opening the space for conversations that could be robust and thought-provoking. And so because the book is already very comprehensive on many issues that can be spoken with regard to bilateral issues, I thought that it would be good for me in my few minutes to speak to and reflect on the current political and historical conjuncture that Sri Lanka is facing. So the question that I want to ask is, with the national economic crisis in 2022 that Sri Lanka faced, and with the narrative that Sri Lanka is slowly making its way out of a debt crisis, what domestic factors more significantly impact the country's foreign relations? And this includes, the Singapore-Sri Lankan relationship. And what choices do we face as a nation? And to start off, I would like to emphasize three main themes here that I will go through during my talk. And this is equity, number two, trust, and number three is ideology. So 2022, last year, was a very turbulent year for Sri Lanka, as we all know. There were the mass street protests, and the sitting president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, resigned from office. This year, in 2023, we see more political stability, and indicators show us that this so-called stability will likely continue at least until the elections which are scheduled for next year. Whatever government is in power next year, the political, economic, and social conditions will be very different to this year. One of the main reasons for this is the IMF bailout agreement that is in place. The Sri Lankan government must implement several painful economic reforms to access this funding. And generally, even though the IMF agreement is not publicly available, we know that this kind of agreement involves reducing government expenditure, increasing revenue through measures such as increasing taxation, privatizing loss-making state-owned enterprises, and then balancing the painful impact of these reforms through social safety nets. Now, already with some of these reforms being implemented this year, there has been a degree of domestic political opposition. Some of this opposition can be interpreted as political opportunism, but some of this opposition is driven by the sentiment that the burden sharing of crisis management is unevenly distributed, with the majority falling on the lower income and middle classes, which are experiencing downward social mobility. So the question here is one of priorities and equity for the Sri Lankan government. Which reforms are prioritized over others? What does that tell us about the issue of equity and the social contract that prevails in Sri Lanka? Who are these reforms for? Whose interests are met and who bear the brunt of these? So this is the equity issue that I wanted to raise, and which is ongoing in Sri Lanka's current domestic context. In Sri Lanka's present context, there is no simple narrative in a situation as complex as this. There are no easy political choices. The current government is carrying out a very unenviable job of doing something very difficult, which is trying to implement some necessary structural reforms at a time when there is a lot of political competition and a weak social contract. And this leads us to the second theme that I want to talk today, which is the issue of trust, of legitimacy. Democratic societies are hinged on public consultation and trust, and building this legitimacy takes time and it is politically costly. However, its benefits are in the long term. Deciding the right balance of being consultative and being decisive is not an easy decision to make. But it is a choice which is always open to leaders, and it is not predetermined. So what I mean by this is that even in times of crisis, leaders have agency. So what choices the Sri Lankan government makes and how it addresses the trust deficit it currently faces is directly linked to the equity issue that I raised before. That is, reforms are necessary, but on what terms are these reforms being carried out? And in what way are they being carried out? Is it carried out with consultation or in a top-down manner? The importance of this is that in the absence of consensus and trust, governments pursue policies that are based on political expediency, and with a lack of popular trust, a lot of these initiatives and policies get disrupted. This in turn affects the policy consistency and stability that is necessary for bilateral relations, such as that between Sri Lanka and Singapore. Some recent really interesting development that happened was that President Wickremesinghe mentioned that they are discussing bringing laws to prevent unilateral withdrawal from international agreements, because this has been a trend in Sri Lanka's foreign policy for a while. And this is excellent. You know, we need more laws and we need more institutions to address policy inconsistency in our foreign policy. But the issue of public trust, of popular trust, is also very key to ensuring policy consistency. So this brings me to my final point on what I see as the third domestic factor, which more significantly impacts Sri Lanka's external engagement. And that is the growing lack of ideological clarity at the domestic level. So what does this mean? Among the main political parties in Sri Lanka, we are seeing an increasing ideological convergence. In the context of crisis, many political groups use the language of political expediency, of pragmatism as the strategy of the hour, and that we are now living in a post-ideological time. However, for persons like myself, for some of us, ideological convergence that we see in Sri Lanka is arguably an indicator of the growing gap between the elector and the elected, the trust deficit that I was talking about earlier. When the main political groups do not differ much ideologically, but only in degree, it shows how ideology is not sufficient to override the role of power politics in the Sri Lankan context. So I think that the present is a good moment for us to reflect on what political ideologies are. Ideologies often get a bad rep for being dogmatically held beliefs, but this is not true. Ideologies are value systems that come about and which various social groups advocate because they understand that not every problem in society can be resolved through a politics of expediency. Social problems have historical roots, they are globally constituted, they are structural in nature, and can't be easily resolved through power calculations. What political ideologies help us do is that it grounds difficult political choices by thinking of communities and groups that have been underrepresented and who don't have as powerful a voice at the decision-making table. Having such a value system is increasingly relevant and increasingly urgent in the Sri Lanka in the situation that Sri Lanka faces, because the trade-offs and choices in implementing these difficult reforms are not easy. What is the danger of having ideological confusion in the Sri Lankan domestic context, and why does this affect its foreign relations? The danger of ideological confusion is that it makes the public have a lack of options, and it does not deliver on the promise of a representative democracy. This alienates the people and their interests and legitimizes more extreme solutions that democracy is seen as having failed. And so we can some of the dangers of this is seeing a populist leader coming into power or a more authoritarian centralized kind of politics. This goes hand in hand with the patronage politics and identity politics that we have seen play out in Sri Lanka since independence. So in conclusion, there is a need for political movements and leaders which question the current dominant aspects of the overarching ideology that plays out in Sri Lanka, and political movements that challenge these prevailing discourses of Sinhala Buddhist hegemony to one of equality, of patronage politics to one of equity, and of violence to one of democratic consultation. The question of how can we talk about democracy between the state and the society when internal party politics in Sri Lanka are undemocratic. So recently, I think the Sri Lankan president in closing said that after debt restructuring is complete, that Sri Lanka will seek to sign FTAs with ASEAN states and intends to join the RCEP agreement. And these can all be positive developments. But I think that one of the key things that needs to happen is that a cohesive ideological narrative, fundamental shift in this ideological narrative, that citizens can buy in and will build some degree of trust in government, will bode well for Sri Lanka's foreign relations. Sri Lanka needs to get its domestic social contract in order for it to have a stable and consistent foreign policy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rajni. Your presentation in a way has made our life a bit difficult also, I must say, because you brought in a couple of new dimensions and factors which are very important, but they're complicated. The equity factor and also the ideological factor. And these are factors with very wicked kind of challenges, not easy to to grapple, but they are part and parcel of the Sri Lankan reality, which we cannot blind eye on. I was thinking, since it's our topic is also has a comparative element, how do we turn back to Singapore and understand how they have dealt with these two factors, the equity and also the ideological. Now, I'm not going to tell about it, but just want to flag that issue. And with that, I would like to thank you, Sri, for the initial submission. And I have some remarks and comments to make, but I would like to give the audience an opportunity. We would not have a lot, a great deal of time to have a long discussion, but we could at least have a short exchange so that this becomes a relatively interactive session. So I would allow 3 questions from the audience to our panel, and your response can be a point of clarification, a comment, or a question to the panelists. So 3 questions only. Interest of time. I see one, contender, and who would like to go next? Yeah, so we start with you.
Hello,
Yeah.
my name is Michael Ayer. I work with a multi-family office here. My question to you would be about Sri Lanka and the legal system. Your rights and laws can be really enforced or not? Because you see, I mean, today's official country name is Socialist Democratic Republic, is it not? But for example, the law of rule, I mean, and basically, can you really enforce your legal recourse in the country?
Sorry, did you? Yeah, because there was the problem of. If you can repeat your question with a better mic, we couldn't hear it very well. Since
the comparison was between Singapore and Sri Lanka, right? I mean, Singapore was run by a lawyer, right? I mean, according to the British media, it was benevolent dictatorship. But in Sri Lanka, for example, how would you increasingly ensure that foreign investors and the general public can actually enforce their claim on, I mean, basically the legal system in Sri Lanka? That is not really clear to me as well as a foreign investor.
Onto that.
I mean, I would just like to refer to the fact that according to the public media, even governors were in sort of questionable activities. And this is exactly what the government here made sure, that a central banker should have enough food to eat, that they don't have to do these sort of things. I'm referring to the Sri Lanka Central Bank again.
I'll try my best. It's more of a comment, right? And yeah, as I mentioned in my small intervention, there are certain structural reforms that has to take place. And my third point was on corruption, crime, and equity in how law is enforced. Of course, we recognize the fact that there are higher standards that the country needs to aspire to. But steps have been taken. Like, for example, we have a new anti-corruption bill, which has been pushed through Parliament. And that's like a mess. Secondly, if you look at, can you hear me? Yeah. Secondly, if you look at investor protection, something that if you're as an investor that you should look at is the new port city that has been built and the infrastructure and the new port city law that has been introduced. So if you're looking at enforcement of contract, I may be corrected on this, but from what I understand, English law applies, and set up on dispute resolution has been brought in. So these are things that progressive things that are happening in the country. And as an investor, that is something that is looked out for. As a proof point, a lot of export companies which have offices overseas, like in Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, and elsewhere, is now in the process, including some of the banks are looking at the port city in a very positive way. And the due diligence process is on. And in the next couple of years, you will see these companies moving from Hong Kong and various other places because of the tax benefit that is being offered. It's a 25-year tax holiday, if I'm not mistaken. And that is something to look out for. But you're right. We need to correct our course correct with respect to corruption and other things. And as you've seen from 2022 to now, there is a significant difference with the new central bank governor coming in, putting in processes and the right decisions being made. And I hope I've answered your question to the best.
Yeah, thank you. We see another question. Yeah, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Anuradha. And there's a wonderful discussion, and we didn't know that there was so much contribution of the Sri Lankan community in Singapore. I have a question for Nitya, and in her comment, she said that some of the Sri Lankans, they were not too happy, not that word, but that they're being identified as Indians, you know, and they prefer to be identified as Tamils. I mean, is there any background to this, or how does this manifest this discomfort, you know? I thought.
Basically, the identification for Tamils is, of course, because historically there were more Jaffna Tamils who came to Singapore. And even when you look at the Indian diaspora, the percentage of Tamils is much higher than the other language groups. So that is what has, I think, brought them to identify themselves with the larger language group compared to the Sinhalese, who are even now at a much smaller number compared to the Tamils. So historically, I mean, that could be the connection between why they identify themselves as Tamil. And we must also remember that even now, if I'm not mistaken, I may be corrected, they are still, according to the government, they're still categorized as Indians. So when we talk about Indians, the connection with Tamils is much closer. So that's my understanding.
Just a quick question. I'm not very knowledgeable on this, but I have heard the term Ceylon Tamil, you know, being used for certain kind of, you know, registration of children, you know, who are born here. I mean, they can be Singaporeans, but the race goes as is Indian, not Ceylon. There's no reference to Ceylon or Sri Lanka.
Indians and others. Chinese, Malay, Indians, and others. That's the broad categorization.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. Now I have some, you know, remarks to make, and also certain questions to, you know, to my panelists. And thank you very much again. Rajni, now I said you made you know, you have rocked the boat a bit, you know, which is also part of, you know, a good panel, and you have brought in a bit of, you know, challenging questions, particularly on the last point you made on the ideological kind of, you know, considerations, particularly in the context of recent developments in Sri Lanka, and you made a particular reference to what took place in 2022, and then the the trajectory after that. Now, interestingly, Singapore has been not a kind of a party, but a kind of a reference point during this short period of challenge from 2022. Initially, it was a place of refuge, and you know what I mean. And then it was also, it turned out to be a place of kind of intense interaction between the two countries. And it's more at a kind of, it's not as a place where you would run when there's a crisis, but a place that you would frequent for more proactive action. And I have noted the frequent visits from Sri Lanka to here, at the ministerial level. And the ministries, represent a wide kind of, scope of, subjects, from public security to environment to, to business and so on. Now, how would you kind of, how would you interpret the new relationships that are in the making, in the from the lens of equity and ideological considerations?
Right. That's a really difficult question to ask, I think, because it has many layers to it. But I think we can keep going back to the question of how Sri Lanka draws inspiration from Singapore, and in particular Singapore's development model. And there are many sides to it. Just very quickly, some of the very positive things that, of course, Sri Lanka stands to learn is, of course, the public administration in Singapore. And I think that there's a lot of learning that needs to be done from the Sri Lankan side of the good lessons that can be emulated in terms of public administration, in terms of law, rule of law and such. But then we can also yes, I think keeping that in mind, all the good lessons that we can learn from Singapore, I think also we need to understand that these are fundamentally different societies in terms of scale. Singapore is a city-state, Sri Lanka is slightly larger. The kind of political systems that run in these two countries, Sri Lanka is a representative democracy. And so because of that, despite Singapore being, I think, a model that our political leaders aspire to, I think that, there are limits to which we can take from each country. The one main thing I'll say is that the development model that Sri Lanka aspires to and which it sees in Sri Lanka is, I would argue, partly responsible for the economic crisis that we are facing today. It is a development model that is based on big infrastructure development, that is based on unregulated capital flows, and the kind of debt that Sri Lankan political leaders have borrowed. And so it's not a very sustainable or publicly responsible kind of development that Sri Lanka has pursued. And so I think when we have models, perhaps it's good to also keep in mind issues of equity that we raised before.
Another quick question related to that. Now, you follow the Sri Lankan politics very closely, and is there a sense of, how do people perceive or look at this evolving relationship between the two countries? Do you see any kind of, significant trend or kind of a feature in this, or they don't kind of, care about it?
I think that, like what Senora said, Singapore is something that it's not only at the political leader level, at the societal level, many Sri Lankans see Singapore as the ideal development state. And again, for good reason, because many things do work in in Singapore. Sorry, so you were saying the question?
No, well, let me not mince my words, Well, the political administration in Sri Lanka is at some level contested, right? And within this kind of contestation, where Sri Lankan, people have different, ideological kind of, orientations, to build on your last point. Do they all see the Sri Lanka Singapore relationships, of recent times in a positive sense?
I would argue that, perhaps someone could disagree with me, that the majority of Sri Lankan people do see Singapore's development model as a positive, or the relations as a positive thing. And I would extend that argument to say that this was one of the reasons that we had the people's protests last year. The people's protest last year was because the government at the time failed its development promise, and the development promise of, what Singapore symbolized to a large extent. I think Gotabaya Rajapaksa also has referred to Singapore as a model. And so, yeah, I would say that the majority of the people actually do support the idea of Singapore's development model. When the Sri Lankan state fails to deliver this, that is what led the people to the streets, rather than the people fundamentally rethinking the way in which politics is done in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. Yes.
China model? Whether you could elaborate on the India versus China development model, because I think as a European, the question always comes up: shall Sri Lanka basically become more like the China or the single party state development model, or still basically rather embrace the India development model as a fully functional democracy? That's, I think, as an important question as well, because as far as I can see, when I go to this debate, eventually elaborate on that.
Rajni, I don't want you to be at the receiving end, all the time. And would Senator or Nitya like to respond to that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. As of now, I think Sri Lanka has taken, from a foreign policy standpoint, from what I understand, is a more neutral position. But from a model aspect, there are, positive examples from both sides. And you also know that Sri Lanka is the oldest democracy in Asia, right? So there are certain traditions that we subscribe to. And we have to find answers on how we manage that relationship and how we also leverage it. And it's like, say, you're European, but there are millions of European companies doing business in China and probably in India as well. And so we have to find our niche, which attracts you to the table. And the Europeans are happy to do business with us. We've been supplying apparels for a very long time. Not only apparels, fish, the list goes on. And so it's still an attractive market, despite the geopolitical to Europe and the West. When I say West, it's the US and North America.
I think we should close the session. But before doing so, I would like to ask my panelists, if you want to convey a very short message, in conclusion, we like to meet, and if you want to add anything to what has been said, discussed, I have you're given a pitch or two.
Since I mentioned that in my talk, I did talk about the deep people-to-people connections in Singapore and Sri Lanka. I think something that is set to go the new wave of migrants. I think the connections are only becoming a hub for technology, for research and development, cybersecurity, AI, all these are industries which I think is promoting, and also be beneficiaries of this. The future looks pretty good, and we'll be seeing a lot more collaborations going forward.
Thank you. Rajni.
Just very briefly, I think it's very good for us to, I think Singapore has, Sri Lanka obviously. Discussion today? Is that okay? Yes. Yes. This works. I don't have much to say, just in closing to say that we have these conceptions of what Singapore stands for, what India stands for, what Sri Lanka stands for, and China stands for example. But these countries are not static, as we know. The Singapore of 1960s is not the Singapore of today. And the full-fledged democracy, perhaps, that India might have been is not the case today. So I think that it's very interesting to always map whatever developments that are happening in any country against the shifts in other countries, because I think that countries learn from each other. And so sometimes some worrying trends in some countries, such as in India, could have repercussions in a place like Sri Lanka. So it's good to have models, I think, but it's also good to be wary of the negative ideals that countries can emulate. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll have just one thing to add, just to summarize what I said. And I think what I said in my intervention complements what Rajni also raised at a more higher and complicated level. So if there is any learning, and if Sri Lanka really wants to course correct, and I'm being very blunt here, Sri Lanka needs to think of serious reforms. And as Rajni said, build that social contract. And more importantly, build that very important trust between citizen and state, and that needs to be rebuilt. And that at this point may not look, very strong at this point, but this is something that Sri Lanka as a country has to find an answer to ensure there is more sustainable sort of growth and progress in the country.
Thank you, Senator Rajni and Nitya, for your insightful presentations and also response to the questions. It was a pleasure, moderating this panel with the three of you, and thank you for the audience. Thanks to ISAS for inviting me, and the High Commission as well. In closing, I would like to make this request rather. What I realized while listening to the two presentations initially by the director and the High Commissioner and the panelists, and the book is an excellent contribution to look back. It's a reflection of the past. I think in the context of, in light of what's happening now, particularly in Sri Lanka, and in the seemingly kind of active relationship between the two countries, I think ISAS as a think tank could also play a more proactive role in supporting the policy discussions, the policy debates in Sri Lanka, and the bilateral kind of space with think pieces, with policy papers to elaborate, to kind of to generate ideas, case studies, and so on from the two countries. I think that's you do an excellent job in terms of taking a historical perspective of documenting, reflecting, analyzing them, but also it's equally important and useful to contribute to contemporary processes of policy making and problem solving, which is really a need of the hour. So with that request, and also while thanking all of you for the excellent time that we had this afternoon, from my side, I would close the panel and leave it to the ISS host to make any announcement to officially close the proceedings.
This now brings us to the end of our panel discussion. It was a very insightful and engaging session. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants and speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in this discussion. We'd like to invite you outside for a tea reception. Have a good evening.